In the early hours of this Wednesday, the United States Central Command issued an order that no maritime security analyst in the Persian Gulf expected to receive this month. The permanent redeployment of naval assets in the Strait of Hormuz, the 24-mile-wide choke point through which approximately 21% of all the petroleum consumed on the planet passes every single day. The operative word was not redeployment, it was permanent. The sheer volume at stake made the tangible meaning of that order crystal clear in a matter of seconds to anyone who fills up a gas tank or pays a utility bill, as roughly 21 million barrels of oil flow through that strait every 24 hours, which is the equivalent of fully loading a supertanker every 6 minutes, without a break, without a holiday, without a single pause, from sunrise to sunset and throughout the dead of night. A single day of total blockade would blow a $2 billion hole in the global economy before breakfast the next morning. And what the United States had just announced completely rewrote the rulebook on who protects and who threatens this critical flow. The central paradox of this maneuver lay in the very logic that sparked it. For decades, the Iranian deterrence strategy in the Persian Gulf relied on a simple and highly effective premise, which was that the threat of closing Hormuz was far more valuable than actually closing it. Iran maintained hundreds of fast attack craft from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the parallel military branch answering directly to the supreme leader, along with thousands of naval mines in coastal depots and Noor and Qadr anti-ship missile batteries positioned along more than 870 miles of coastline. All of this existed to never be used. The strategic value was entirely in the threat, not in the execution. But something had shifted in the equation, and the shift did not originate in Tehran. It came straight from Washington. And here was the crucial data point that mainstream reports were not highlighting with the frequency it deserved. Over the last 18 months, the Pentagon had quietly shifted roughly 35% of the naval assets that previously operated on rotation in the Persian Gulf over to the Indo-Pacific theater. Aircraft carriers that used to make regular port calls at the 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain were increasingly diverted for joint military exercises with Japan, Australia, and the Philippines as part of the broader strategy to contain China in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait. The result was a vacuum, not a rhetorical vacuum, but a highly measurable vacuum calculated in tonnage of steel, radar range, and missile interception capabilities. The Iranian regime observed this void with the precise calculation of an adversary monitoring every American naval movement via satellite, signals intelligence, and informants in allied ports. The fundamental equation had shifted, and it was exactly in this context that the IRGC executed over the past few weeks a series of maneuvers that analysts at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London classified as the most significant reconfiguration of the Iranian military posture in the Strait since 2012. New Khalij-Fars anti-ship ballistic missile batteries, boasting an estimated range of roughly 186 miles and a 1,430-pound warhead capable of striking any vessel in the entire strait from fortified fallback positions deep within Iranian territory, were identified by commercial satellite imagery at no less than 3 new sites along the Hormozgan province coastline. Simultaneously, Iran reactivated the Jask naval base just east of the strait, deploying there for the very first time a permanent flotilla of Ghadir-class submarines, which are small, 120-ton vessels specifically designed to operate in shallow waters and launch torpedoes against massive ships in extremely narrow corridors. The price tag of each Ghadir, according to Western defense analysts, does not exceed $35 million, a microscopic fraction of the cost of an American Arleigh Burke-class destroyer that is valued at roughly $2 billion a pop. The sheer asymmetry was the entire point, but the true ripple effect of this operation went far beyond the tactical numbers on the battlefield. Take a step back and look at the big picture. What Iran was doing was not preparing to physically choke off Hormuz. It was raising the cost of keeping Hormuz open to a threshold that would force Washington to make a choice no American president ever wanted to make in public: protect the Persian Gulf or contain China in the Pacific. Both missions demanded the exact same ships, the exact same aircraft carrier strike groups, and the exact same Aegis missile defense systems. And the United States simply did not have enough fleet to go around for both simultaneously. The Congressional Budget Office itself had published a report back in March indicating that the United States Navy was operating with 294 combat ships, hitting its lowest numbers since 1992, while the official Pentagon target required an absolute minimum of 355 vessels to meet all global strategic obligations. The glaring gap between what was on hand and what was required amounted to 61 ships, 61 ghost ships that existed on planning spreadsheets but were nowhere to be found on the actual ocean. And here was the catch-22 that military planners had failed to factor in. Every single aircraft carrier shifted to the Pacific to keep China in check was one less carrier in the Gulf to deter Iran. Every carrier anchored in the Gulf to hold off Iran was one less carrier in the Pacific to counter China. And both adversaries, Tehran and Beijing, knew this perfectly well. The greatest paradox of the entire geopolitical crisis rested precisely here. The massive weapon Washington had built to project simultaneous power across two oceans, the undisputed largest navy in the world, was currently being stretched to the absolute breaking point where it could not successfully fulfill either mission with the necessary margin of safety. The ultimate instrument of power had essentially morphed into the ultimate instrument of vulnerability. In the dark shadow of this monumental strategic miscalculation, there was one key player watching the whole board with calculated satisfaction. And here was the actor that the daily headlines were failing to mention with the necessary urgency: China. Beijing imports approximately 11 million barrels of crude oil a day, of which roughly 40% travels right through the Strait of Hormuz, sourced from Iran, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait. Any hint of instability in the Strait would send the price of Brent crude skyrocketing by proportions that Goldman Sachs analysts estimated would land between $25 and $40 per barrel in a partial blockade scenario, and between $80 and $130 in the event of a total shutdown. That would easily translate to gas prices well over $9 a gallon in the United States and over €3 a litre across Europe, which are the kind of historic price shocks that routinely topple governments in an election year. But China had spent the last decade quietly building a backdoor alternative, the China-Myanmar pipeline, capable of pumping 440,000 barrels a day from the Indian Ocean straight into Yunnan province, entirely bypassing the Strait of Malacca and severely reducing Chinese reliance on Hormuz. At the same time, Beijing was hoarding strategic petroleum reserves estimated at a staggering 950 million barrels, which is more than enough to maintain normal imports for about 86 days without a single drop coming from the outside. Every single day of crisis in Hormuz inherently hurt China's rivals significantly more than it hurt China itself. The geopolitical chessboard had been completely flipped. Really think about what this operational number represents on the ground. Admiral John Smith, the commander of the Bandar Abbas Naval Zone and a highly decorated 32-year veteran with 2 commendations for Gulf operations during the tanker wars of the 1980s, had proudly declared to a semi-official news agency just last week that his forces possessed the capability to mine the entire navigable corridor of the Strait in under 48 hours. This man is not the emotional focal point of this analysis. He is the exact investigative coordinate of what the regime considers practically possible and what American naval intelligence must now consider highly probable. The historical analogy that most accurately captures this shifting dynamic is not the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which lazy analysts always seem to drag out whenever 2 nuclear adversaries face off in a tight geographical space. It is actually the Suez Canal Crisis of 1956, when Nasser's Egypt nationalized a maritime corridor that the West considered completely untouchable, and the subsequent Anglo-French military response, which was technically victorious on the battlefield, ultimately resulted in a massive strategic humiliation that completely redefined who held real power in the Middle East. The parallel is not about the kinetic military action. It is about the painfully delayed realization that physically controlling a maritime corridor does not equal controlling the political, economic, and diplomatic fallout of fighting over it. The British and the French learned the hard way in '56 that the United States would not have their backs. The burning question in 2026 was whether the Persian Gulf allies, primarily Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Bahrain, would suddenly discover that the United States could no longer protect them and contain China at the very same time. And that brings us to the ultimate question that no talking head on television was answering with nearly enough clarity. The American response announced this Wednesday that permanent redeployment meant in practical terms the rapid installation of long-range anti-ship missile systems across allied islands and coastal bases surrounding the Strait, partially swapping out the floating presence of aircraft carriers for a hardened fixed network of land-based sensors and serious firepower. The concept, which the Pentagon internally referred to as distributed maritime denial, would cost roughly $4.5 billion over the next 3 years, representing a mere fraction of the cost of operating a single aircraft carrier strike group for the equivalent time frame, which runs around $14 billion. The cost savings were undeniably real, but the strategic signal it sent was absolutely devastating. The United States was openly admitting, for the very first time since 1979, that it would no longer maintain a continuous, dominant naval presence in the Persian Gulf. They were essentially trading physical presence for lethal capacity. Visible warships were being swapped for invisible missiles. A floating deterrence was being replaced by a fixed one. It was a completely silent revolution in the security architecture of the most strategically volatile region on the planet. Every additional day was another day of mounting pressure on the nations that relied most heavily on that resource, nations that would inevitably leverage a kind of pressure on Washington that the White House, sooner rather than later, would be completely unable to ignore. Saudi Arabia, which exports roughly 6.5 million barrels daily through terminals accessed via the Gulf, had already initiated backdoor talks with Beijing about expanding the use of the yuan in high-level oil transactions, a pivotal move that just 5 years ago would have been considered totally unthinkable for Washington's top Arab ally. The United Arab Emirates were rapidly accelerating the construction of the Habshan-Fujairah pipeline, which would allow them to divert up to 1.8 million barrels a day from the Gulf straight to the Indian Ocean, bypassing the Strait entirely by land. Every piece of alternative infrastructure built was a silent vote of no confidence in the American capacity to keep Hormuz open. And votes of no confidence in the harsh realm of geopolitics have a nasty tendency to become self-fulfilling prophecies. This is not just some isolated regional crisis. It is the first real-world stress test of exactly who controls the critical energy arteries of the 21st century, and the final results of this test will fundamentally redraw the global map of power for decades to come. What radically changed this Wednesday in the Strait of Hormuz was not merely the positioning of a few missiles or the naval doctrine of a struggling superpower. It was the tacit, undeniable recognition that the golden era in which a single nation could guarantee the security of all the world's oceans simultaneously had officially reached its breaking point. The lingering question that remains, and that no highly classified official document in Washington, Tehran, or Beijing is willing to answer, is exactly what happens when the next major incident in the Strait goes down and the nearest American aircraft carrier is a full 12 days of hard sailing away. Currently positioned somewhere in the Philippine Sea, the Strait itself has not moved an inch, but the power that once guarded it certainly has. If this deep dive makes sense for your understanding of what is truly at stake in the world right now, make sure to subscribe and turn on those notifications, because Hormuz is not dropping out of the headlines anytime soon, and every single update is going to matter far more than the last. The next move on the board was already being calculated,